Early in America's history, the European explorers who came to these shores brought with them hopes and dreams of a new life. They also brought with them differing notions of how to do that. The British, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch, among others, saw a land of great opportunity and resources. The poet Catherine Bates described in the last line seen here of her 1893 poem the words, "A land from sea to shining sea." The colonists looked at the vast territory beyond the borders the British had assigned to them. They decided they wanted some of that land from sea to shining sea for themselves. "No, you can't go there," the King of England said. And the king showed the colonists a boundary they would never be allowed to cross over. The King's Royal Proclamation Act of 1763 officially sealed the borders, telling your growing adolescent child where they can't go, what they can't see or can't do, is a surefire way to see them go do it. The left side of this map was where those brash pioneering colonists set out to see for themselves, and they never looked back. Thomas Jefferson, as president in 1804, echoed those sentiments when, after the Revolutionary War was over, purchased a huge swath of land we know as the Louisiana Purchase. It doubled the landmass of the newly christened United States overnight. Later, Jefferson commented that he had, quote, "stretched the Constitution until it cracked," unquote, according to the Smithsonian American Art Museum. This conversation in art will look at how that westward expansion unfolded, how ideologies, competing ideologies to be sure, began to take shape. In particular, we will look at how a one-sided story of westward expansion began, and the challenges of teaching a different point of view. Let's consider the other point of view, if we may, that of the indigenous peoples. Those First Nations who were told two things by the immigrants from the Old World. First, what the Native Americans heard was a clear message of exclusion. We see that for the first time in our Declaration of Independence. This declaration defined them, these Native Americans, as, quote, "merciless savages," end quote. It's right there, 30 lines below the statement, "all men are created equal." Merciless savages were considered to be subhuman and not even considered worthy of participation in America's dream. That's pretty harsh language of oppression, especially coming from a people who were themselves tired of being oppressed by a king and by others. This message of exclusion came directly from God, the Declaration of Independence states. It was part of God's providence, God's divine providence. You see that language in the closing words of the Declaration of Independence, quote, "With a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." End quote. Anyone who was not white, who did not speak the King's English, who did not read the King James Bible, who did not worship the same God as they did, they were not entitled to live here. Divine providence, it was explained, said no. The second thing Native Americans were told was a message of ideology, something we have curiously come to call manifest destiny. It sounds very close to what the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence, a Presbyterian named John Witherspoon, would preach about throughout his career, calling it predestination. That's a complex dogma not even a 21st century Presbyterian can understand. Manifest destiny was, in fact, a philosophy made famous, interestingly, by the pen of a newspaper writer in 1845. His name was John O'Sullivan. He borrowed that phrase from earlier writers. He declared that Providence has given us this destiny. In other words, only the European immigrant and their offspring were entitled by sacred pronouncement to settle the continent from coast to coast. Let's start with this painting by Emanuel Leutze, the German pronunciation. We'll simply call his name Emanuel Lutz. It's a huge wall painting for the U.S. Capitol, located in the west stairway of the U.S. Capitol on the House of Representatives side. The painting was completed in November of 1862. Lutz officially entitled it "Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way." Emanuel Lutz was a German-born artist who moved to the United States. You will recognize his earlier work called Washington Crossing the Delaware. The Westward expansion painting shows a group of pioneers with their covered wagons. They are pictured reaching the top of the U.S. Continental Divide. We see the sun setting on the left towards the Pacific Ocean. Hold on to that thought. We'll come back to this concept of the sun setting towards the Pacific Ocean in a few minutes. The message Lutz helped popularize was America's growing mythology of becoming the next promised land. Heroes like Lewis and Clark and Daniel Boone are central to this narrative. Lutz developed his romanticized myths as he worked on preliminary studies for his large mural. One image he wrestled with was what to do with African Americans. In his oil sketch of 1861, a preliminary sketch, which is now in the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, you will see no reference to African Americans. In fact, neither did his large mural that he finished. Lutz decided, however, the final version needed to be a bit corrected. He felt it should show one person of color. You see that new depiction right here. Following Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1862, Lutz went back and added the image of an African American young man as a freed slave. We see this large painting, women, children, and beasts of burden, rumbling through a mountain pass. Rugged, snow-covered mountains in the Rockies show the difficulties the brave pioneers have to deal with. As a painting, let's look for the symbols, for symbols abound throughout this artwork. The back right side of the painting hints at an approaching darkness, a frequent symbol of death and hardship. Desiccated bones of dead animals are visible, as are broken wagon wheels. In Lutz's earlier oil sketch, we will see a Christian funeral taking place. In the larger mural, further Christian symbols can be found. Please note that Lutz, a German painter, trained in European artistic traditions, would be familiar with this visual symbolic association. Two thoughts come to mind. One is, look at a mother holding a child while she reaches for her family Bible, seen here on the right. This image echoes a famous painting by the Italian artist Raphael in the year 1510, a painting of the Madonna, Child, and Bible, which is now housed at the National Gallery of Art in D.C. The second image is of a pioneer man, his wife in a blue robe with red headdress holding an infant. Red, white, and blue are intentional for the colors. Let's call her the American Madonna. Some observers have seen echoes of the Holy Family, that is, Joseph, Mary, and the baby Jesus, in a mountainous terrain seeking a new home. One key image that Lutz employs is the scene on top of the cliff. I see echoes of earlier previous artworks. Do you see the young man signaling to his fellow travelers? Look, he is saying, look up ahead. Better days are right over there, pointing into the distance. Lutz, I suggest to you, is echoing a famous historical painting from the year 1818. He would be familiar with this European artwork. It's painted by a Frenchman named Theodore Géricault. This large work is entitled Raft of the Medusa. It's a famous painting of an old eternal story of humankind versus nature. This particular raft scene is based on a true story. Survivors from a shipwreck wait for rescue. Travelers lost on a dangerous voyage desperately wave at a passing ship barely visible in the distance up ahead. Will they make it? Lutz knew the answer to Jericho's question. Yes, they made it. Hope replaces despair. Lutz's message in his painting is a message of hope and providential blessing. They abound in the imagery throughout this large artwork. In fact, if you have a magnifying glass, you can even see border details depicting historical events, elaborating these symbolic themes. Divine destiny is made manifest, it's made visible. Westward expansion is glorified, if not deified. But, sadly, those indigenous peoples who had been living here in America for the past 10,000 years are not part of that narrative. They are now told to go somewhere else. Their hopes are denied. Their removal, if not their eradication, is divinely justified. A second painting is also important, I think, for us to look at. We could say it helped create an American mythology which is still alive and well in our national ethos. This painting, made in the year 1872, conveys the same sentiments as our previous painting by Lutz. This painting is entitled American Progress. It was made by another European painter named John Gast. He was born and trained in Berlin. He depicts the same theme of westward expansion. John Gast was invited by a publisher named George Crowfoot to be a business partner in a venture that would capitalize on the growing demand for westward expansion. Crowfoot commissioned Gast to paint a picture that he could use for a series of tourist guides and travel books, enticing others to go west. Gast's painting, American Progress, was reproduced as a chromolithograph image used multiple times over the next few years. Note how Gast divides his canvas into two sections. Beginning on the right, where the morning dawns with the sunrise over the east coast, we see ships in a harbor sending settlers westward. All manners of transportation are visualized. Train tracks on the right stretch across the landscape. Gast himself watched as the first transcontinental railroad was being completed 3 years before this painting. Stagecoaches and Conestoga wagons take European immigrants to new homes across the Mississippi. A lone horseman seen in the center becomes a symbol for the new Pony Express. On the left side of the painting, we begin to see the opposite point of view. It has no glowing sunshine. Ominous black clouds threaten overhead. Bison stampede to safety. Desiccated bones litter the ground. You will find no death on the right side of the painting. In Gast's world, death does not exist. But on the left, fearful Native Americans flee for their lives. A grizzly bear bottom left snarls at threats to his life. You don't want to be on the left side of this painting. This photo serves as a reminder that 60 million buffalo were slaughtered, many for the purpose of eradicating the food and clothing sources for Native Americans. General Philip Sheridan, hero of the Northern Army in the Civil War, was later tasked with solving the problem of indigenous peoples resisting white authority. Asked in 1883 his views on American Indians, he replied, quote, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," end quote. And Theodore Roosevelt thought he was being more kind than Sheridan when he stated in 1886, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are the dead Indians, but I do believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. We now know our treatment of Native peoples has also influenced, regrettably, other nations. Perhaps the most notable has been the story of Germany after World War I. History tells us that Adolf Hitler rose to power in the 1920s. And while he was coming to power, he looked for models of repression to design his own system of racial laws against minority peoples. America and the American story suited his needs nicely. One author, James Whitman, in his book Hitler's American Model, describes Hitler's admiration for America's mistreatment of Native Americans. In 1928, Hitler praised the way the Americans, quote, "gunned down millions of redskins to a few 100,000 and now keep the modest remnant under observation in cages," end quote. Carol Kakel, in his book, The American West and the Nazi East, identifies Hitler's need for more living space, more living room. The removal of the Jews soon unfolded. The American need for more living space drove the wagon trains westward. The official American policy was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Congress ordered the forced removal of Native Americans from their homelands. Andrew Jackson's speech, seen here in print, proudly states that year in December, "It gives me great pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching to a happy consummation." We now refer to that Indian removal as simply the Trail of Tears. In May of 1838, federal soldiers and state militia, similar to this photo, rounded up 16,000 Cherokee from the southeast, taking them to stockades. Overall, 100,000 indigenous peoples, including the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations, were removed from their lands. Of the Cherokee, 4,000 died. Most were buried in unmarked graves. When I was a young boy growing up in western North Carolina near the Cherokee Tribal Reservation, my family took me to see the story of the Trail of Tears. This grainy photograph shows the historical reenactment set in an outdoor amphitheater on the Cherokee Reservation. What my school textbooks and my teachers failed to tell me about Native American history, I learned in one evening, a powerful memory I still hold. One summer night, I watched, mesmerized, as the dramatic story of the Trail of Tears unfolded. I saw performers on stage of the powerful production entitled Unto These Hills. It has stayed with me ever since. This modern painting by Max Standley shows an elderly grandmother in tears leading her people on a trail to who knows where. How different that is to our 19th century John Gast painting. The woman leading the way here is a white idealized goddess with flowing blonde hair. She is larger than life. She floats effortlessly above the ground. Telegraph wires she is laying will link the East Coast with the West Coast before the day is done. Light follows wherever she goes. The star of empire adorns her headdress. The world of John Gast is one of myth and providential destiny. The myth is one of superiority. The destiny is one of dominance. Do you remember Lute's image of travelers reaching the top of the U.S. continental divide? We mentioned it a few minutes ago. They were gazing westward toward the Pacific Ocean at the setting sun. The end of the trail awaits them. Lutz also painted a second panel of the Pacific Ocean scene. It's part of a separate panel positioned just below his main scene. It's the Northern California Bay Area of San Francisco. The top image is their hope. The lower image is the realization of that hope. They made it there. I hear echoes in Lute's imagery. I hear them not just in the story of westward expansion, but I also hear echoes of those native peoples forced there without their consent. Their trail of tears became for them a destination they didn't want. I wonder if this lower painting might somehow also be seen as a metaphor not just for the pioneer and westward expansion, but also a metaphor for the Native American and the Trail of Tears. I'd like to close with this final image. It's a sculpture entitled End of the Trail. It's a large statue. It commemorates the trials and hardships of the seemingly endless walk taken by the Native Americans. The sculptor is Earl Fraser. He was born in the Dakota Territory in 1876. He wrote in his memoirs, quote, "As a boy, I remember an old Dakota trapper saying, 'The Indians will someday be pushed into the Pacific Ocean.'" That memory inspired this artwork. Fraser began his model for this sculpture in 1894. He envisioned the moment that a Native American man came to the end of his long sojourn. He has just stopped at the edge of America's western frontier, the Pacific Ocean. Different versions of this artwork were created by Fraser throughout his career. His work spoke to people on many different levels. He captures the power of a single moment in time. When the Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City was built in 1955 and later remodeled, it asked for a white plaster sculpture by Fraser to install on its grounds. The museum saw in Fraser's iconic imagery a Native American on his horse. Both of them, weary in body and spirit, were at the end of their journey. They struggle just to stay upright. Dark, gray skies hover over a reflecting pool suspended above the Ozark Mountains. I find this photo, taken by Alan Sorensen, particularly poignant. I see symbols of peoples of all races and lands. I hear echoes of those who died on the Trail of Tears, those who were told they were no longer welcome in the place of their birth. But it's also, I think, a symbol of hope. A hope that at the end of the day, with the metaphor of an amber-hued setting sun, we recognize a hope that we might be able to view those peoples of First Nations anywhere with dignity and respect. That is something we believe is entitled to all of us. Thank you for watching.